Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar. I hope everyone's doing well. And we're going to today be covering monitoring practices so that we can combat alert fatigue. As a little bit of background, my name is Quintessence. I work for Logz.io. I am a developer advocate, which I like to call a recovering SRE. And basically what that means is I've been working in the community for about 10 years. I spent some time in cloud engineering slash, infrastructure automation and an SRE role before starting as a developer advocate so that I could help share knowledge that I was learning so that we can all build better communities and forge forward. Outside of that, I actually mentor underrepresented minorities where I am locally, which is Buffalo, New York, and near Niagara Falls. And that's been something that I've actually been doing for quite a few years now, and I actually really enjoy. So if you have any questions about that or about anything in this presentation after the fact, please feel free to just hit me up on Twitter, and you can see my handle on the right-hand side. For what we'll be talking about today, I'm basically going to be covering what to monitor, why we care about it, and how we can actually create a workflow so that we can actually be on point. And it's not just a mess of information that we're trying to overcome and overwhelm. And with that said, I'm going to just get started on the overwhelm. And the overwhelm looks kind of like this. You kind of get started and you think to yourself, maybe you're at a startup, which is where I used to work. And when I was at the startup, you don't trust the system you inherited because you don't know it, you're not personally familiar with it. So you say, okay, I'll start hooking things into Slack or email or PagerDuty or whatnot. And before you know it, you're just getting alert on everything. And as you can see a little bit to the left and right there, sometimes, HR wants to join in on the notification bandwagon so that team building things can happen. And the result is that everything just becomes so loud that you can't actually keep track of any individual thing anymore. And when you can't keep track of anything, it all becomes inactionable, right? Because if you're not seeing, network is down, US East 1, etc., you start to block alerts so that you can try and prioritize the noise. But if you're just blocking alerts, you're not necessarily blocking the right alerts or the right alert sources. And then you've just created a vacuum. And when you've created a vacuum without kind of being mindful and doing your due diligence, you get suspicious Squidward because you don't trust the silence. You know that the silence isn't really silent. You're just kind of in combat mode where you're just very tired and you're trying to, coerce a situation where you can actually function and handle the things that you need to handle. So we actually need to find a happy medium so that we don't get surprised by alerts, but at the same time, we do get notified about the things that we want to hear about. And the reason we care about all of this is because noise isn't just some background thing that just happens to us, right? Our brains are always on. And what do I mean by that? If you've ever been sitting in a room, and you ever notice people chattering, you might not be actively listening to their conversation, but your brain is most certainly passively listening to their conversation. And if you've ever leapt into a conversation and said, oh, hey, I heard you're talking about the meeting tomorrow, or if you've been around maybe a sibling or a significant other or any sort of family situation or roommate where maybe they really have an obsession about a topic, and all of a sudden you find that you know about that topic without personally researching that topic, it's because it's in your environment, it's in your background noise, and it's still making its way in there. It's still using mental cycles, but you're also trying to use other mental cycles to work. But background radiation isn't the only type of noise that we have to encounter in the workplace. And so one type of noise, and this was actually studied by Gloria Mark at UC Irvine, and what she did is she created a study where people were supposed to do simple tasks and then they were interrupted. And to be clear, the type of interruption wasn't a complete task change, right? So to put this as a kind of analogous example, you're working on fixing Kubernetes, which odds are at least some of you are. you're working on fixing Kubernetes, and then Joe developer comes up and says, hey, what's the Wi-Fi password? And you tell them the Wi-Fi password, and then you go back to trying to fix Kubernetes, as opposed to a different type of interruption where you're like, oh, there's a service outage and I need to now address that. So in the what's the Wi-Fi password example, that very simple blip of interruption, on average, people lose 25 minutes. And this is the total cost of loss. And what I mean by that is, obviously it doesn't take 25 minutes to tell someone the Wi-Fi password, even if you have to look it up. But after you've done that, you have to redirect back to where you were and try to get back to the same state you were in, the same step in the problem that you were solving before the interruption. And adding that in is where we get into this 25-minute delay. So if you start to kind of think through a little bit for a moment, how many interruptions you have through the day where someone just needs that simple thing that's not a big deal, that actually over time can become a very massive time sink. It's of course not the only time sink, right? Because when you get interrupted and you're redirecting your attention, you actually will lose the quality of the product that you're trying to build or produce. And this was actually verified by yet another study. And in this study, students were actually tested on AP exams. And for those unfamiliar, it's a US test. It's scored 0 to 6. Currently, it used to be scored 0 to 5. Same approximate range. But what they found is when people were interrupted, they actually would drop about half to a full point. And when you have such a small scale, that's actually a really significant drop. And so again, this is just a simple, hey, you're writing an essay or solving the problems on the test, and someone's just giving you a quick interruption of the nature of, hey, where's the bathroom? And then you go back to taking your test. And it still causes like a massive drop in test scores. And this also goes back to, you're trying to fix Kubernetes, you're trying to get back into the state you were last at pre-interruption. Not only does it take you 20 minutes to try and get back into the state that you were in, but can you really ever recover the exact same state you were in previously? Because as we go through, we're always changing, we're always getting new ideas, something might have occurred to you, or flip side, something may have been forgotten in the brief interruption when your thought bubble burst. And that's where you start to see this quality degradation over time as more and more interruptions appear. Now, this might sound really awful. So then we think to ourselves, oh, let's try multitasking. Like, that sounds like a great idea, right? So you're like, okay, if I can just work on Kubernetes while I'm shouting the Wi-Fi password, it'll be mostly fine. Except it's not. Your brain is still processing what I sometimes nickname the background tabs in the browser of your brain. And we're not computers. We can't like multi-thread that way. We can't split our tasks that way. And this was actually verified by UMichigan. They had a group of students do a 300-person group, for the record, do a sequence-based task. And so the idea was to make the task as simple as possible. Think of like Bart Simpson writing sentences on the chalkboard style, very repetitive. And they wanted to see what would happen with the interruptions. And the result was, perhaps unsurprisingly, that the error rate went up when people were trying to multitask between focusing on what they actually need to be focusing on and kind of background focusing on these interruptions. So this divided focus doesn't actually help us. So now that we've kind of covered why this is actually really bad for us as people, like why we need to fix it instead of just letting it lie, what do we do, right? So how do we proceed in a way where we reduce the noise mindfully so that we can trust the silence? First off, we need to be aware of what's going on. You don't need to necessarily be overwhelmed, although certainly when you have all these alarms or Slack notifications and email notifications and so on going off, it can certainly start to trigger a lot of anxiety or a lot of overwhelm. But if you take a step back internally and take a breath and start to actually filter through your own noise with whatever systems you have set up, you can actually overcome the overwhelm and start to categorize, because you'll have different types of noise. You can put it in a workflow, and then once you have a workflow, you'll have things arriving to you. It might still be rapid fire, but at least it will be more streamlined as opposed to just this cacophony of background radiation, as I've mentioned before. So when I say sources of noise, to the earlier slide where you have, Slack popping up and email popping up, you kind of get even on a simple infrastructure sort of diagram on the right there, you can see how things very rapidly start to ping all over the place. You might have GitHub hooked into Slack and email so that you know when PRs or issues are being flagged. You have an incident manager. You might have something like Elastic for monitoring or keeping track of log entries. You might have Confluence and Jira or whatever else. And all of these things are talking to each other intentionally because you've configured them to do so. You have these these ticketing systems and so forth. It's also important to notice that you yourself are in the system. And what I mean by that is you are a source of noise. You are your own source of noise, as that alert makes pretty clear. You get emails, you get social media notifications, you get text messages and so on throughout the day. And depending on what type of situation you have set up for your kind of out of band communications that aren't happening exclusively because your infrastructure, you might actually be getting quite a few of these notifications either popping up on your phone, or as we become increasingly integrated with all of our smart devices, you might have a laptop and a tablet and a phone and a smartwatch, and everything's integrated, which means even if you turn off your phone, messages are still appearing on one or more of these other devices. It's not actually quiet. Now, you also might say to yourself, well, what if I need that message from my roommate, significant other, whomever else, to tell me to pick up the milk on the way home? And you're not necessarily wrong, but it's also worth mentioning that there's like low versus high priority noise in our personal lives as well as our professional lives. And what that means is both professionally and personally, you just need to communicate and set some boundaries. For example, if you know, like I know, my time zone is different than some of my coworkers' time zones. So I intentionally keep my mornings very free because if they're going to need a meeting, their afternoons and my mornings overlap. And I communicate that with people. So I say, okay, I can't commit to anything before a certain hour in the morning so that I can be available for any ad hoc meetings that appear on my calendar. This includes friends and family. For example, you can say, hey, please don't text me during the workday until maybe 4 or 5 p.m., whatever your personal boundary is, unless it's an emergency, unless you actually need me to take action on something right away. If you just want me to do something on the way home, please wait till I'm legitimately almost on the way home. And once you start setting these expectations, you and people in your lives, you can start to make room for each other because they can't know to not contact you unless you ask them. But flipping back into our actual monitoring systems where we're getting additional notifications from, like incident management and things like that, how do we control that? And this is where we start to workflow a bit. So when you're creating an infrastructure alert monitoring metric system, you might find that, especially if the system was in existence before you started cleaning it up, you might have some things in your noise that you don't actually want to have. These are things like false positives and negatives that might be getting triggered because they're pointing to an old endpoint that doesn't actually give you realistic data, or it's checking something incorrectly, there's been an update in your application, a database has been deleted or migrated, things like that, where these notifications are appearing because they're still alive, but what they're connecting to is no longer relevant. You might also find for the last two that certain systems or services are just chattier than others, and it might not be legitimate noise in the sense if it's fragile. You might want to look at that and see if it's something that you can fix if it's frequently breaking. If it's the same error message all the time and it's not because of something that's like a false positive negative situation where it just needs to be reconfigured and you fix it, then you can actually eliminate all that extra chatter without having to worry about your noise endpoints or anything else like that. Once you start to categorize your noise and know what you need to keep and what's actually relevant, you can start to prioritize it in a way that makes sense. And what I mean by in a way that makes sense is not everyone needs to know everything, which might seem straightforward, but especially when you're in a startup situation, you definitely get everyone into these jack of all trades scenarios, which might work for the first developer and then the first and second developer. But by the time you're scaling to a team size environment, does the front end developer really need to get a PagerDuty notification if the database is down? They can't do anything about it. They can't help anything. It might wake them up at 4 a.m. for them to do something, not at all. So you want to make sure that you know what needs to be known and who needs to know it, but you also need to know how emergent it is. And by that, I mean, if the database is down, the person who's responsible for taking action to correct that problem should know very quickly and very loudly. It should grab their attention. Where if it's a lower priority issue, where maybe it's a bug that's only encountered less than 1% of the time, that definitely needs to be fixed, but it's not exploding the whole product, you can say, okay, well, this team needs to know about this bug, but we'll just create a ticket and they'll just see it appear in their workflow. We don't necessarily need to be setting off alarms, buzzing phones, or anything like that that's going to be very loud and distracting. And once people start to get used to this idea that they're only getting notified about what directly impacts them or what they can directly take action on, as the silence starts to appear, they'll actually start to trust the silence. So going back to the earliest slide, when you think about suspicious Squidward, you're suspicious because you think to yourself, well, I muted all these Slack channels because I'm not personally a front-end developer or back-end developer or on the infrastructure team or whatever. But now, because all of our alerts are going into one place, I don't know my own stuff. And now that you separated it out in a way that logically makes sense based on how you've designed your application, how you've designed your infrastructure, how you designed your teams, you can say, okay, I'm a front-end developer and I'm only getting notifications about front-end things. So when it's quiet, I know that nothing is going on in the front end that I need to touch, so I can legitimately concentrate on whatever innovation or tickets are in my queue that I need to address. I know I just spent quite a bit of time about talking about how to really streamline things so that things are very efficient, but it's also important to make sure you have enough redundancy where you can recover from a sort of failure in your alert systems. What do I mean by that? A lot of places, because we all use like Slack or PagerDuty or VictorOps or something, you might be sending all of your alert endpoints to one place, which in terms of people expecting things to come from one consistent place, super helpful. But if for some reason that consistent place has its own outage, you don't want to be stuck in a scenario where you're like, okay, well, we're having an outage, but we're not getting notified because our notification system is having an outage. This actually happened, or potentially happened, I should say, a year or so ago when Slack had a minor outage. And I actually was thinking about this during Slack's outage. And Slack doesn't have an outage frequently, and they fixed it efficiently and quickly, as you would expect from Slack. But if we didn't have the ability to roll into a different alerting mechanism, then that would have created silence for us. And we would have had to rely on human reporting to let us know if anything was going on. And again, with Slack, it was a brief window, but when you're talking about maybe a different service where you might have an artificial vacuum being created by your endpoints, you need to make sure that you can flexibly change those endpoints once you know that there's a problem with one of them. And as you have this kind of resiliency built in and kind of reduce Squidward, when we've already talked about this, a bit, you actually can just trust your silence once again. So I'm not going to rehash all of these items, but you can see you need to regularly evaluate your tools, right? So I talk about Slack and I picked on them a little bit, but they're overall really reliable. But let's say it's not Slack and it's some other third-party service. If you find out that it's having frequent outages because you're watching for those outages, do you need to reevaluate your usage of that tool entirely? Is it something that you want to keep if you know that it's unreliable? Does it fit a certain need that maybe you can either customize or rip out and replace, or that you can design around so that you don't have to worry about kind of micromanaging this flaky third-party service? But getting back to the alerts themselves and going past, the actual endpoints, the alerts, when we have alerts that are going off, sometimes they can just be cleaned up. And this isn't necessarily the false positive, false negative, et cetera thing. Sometimes an alert goes off and it just resolves. And it depends on how you've built the solution around what's triggered. You might have something that was triggering frequently. So you're like, you know what, let's put some auto healing in this. Let's make this automatically scale so that we don't run out of capacity as quickly, and so on and so forth. As a result, you can reevaluate if you need that notification anymore, if it needs to be replaced with a different type of notification, where in the case of the healing, you don't need to know if the service breaks, you need to know if the repair mechanism breaks. And that changes the context of the alert that you're receiving. You need to kind of ask if the situation's been automated away. And in the case of healing, the situation might be permanently resolved and you can just wipe certain things out. As you're going through and iteratively changing things, I actually recommend keeping alerts clean with sprint cleaning, as I've called it there. And the reason I call it that is because if you're doing it regularly, you can do it little bits at a time. And I don't know about you guys, but I've certainly worked at jobs before where we discovered that we just had a bunch of cruft that we just needed to clean out. But then cleaning the cruft became its own set of tasks and was in our regular sprints, and it took time. So instead of spending maybe 5 or 10 minutes every week or every other week, however often you do sprints or whatever your corresponding schedules are, we actually had to devote a project. We had to make a mini project to do on top of, the bug fixes and the feature innovation, just to keep things clean, to get it into a workable state again. But because of that, when I was at that position, we started cleaning them out regularly to avoid ever needing to do that again. So to review, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to make a situation where you all feel empowered to be able to clean out your alerts, streamline your noise that remains, and keep them regularly occurring in a way that is useful to you, so that you don't find yourself in a situation where you're trying to fix things consistently or where you feel overwhelmed by noise in such a way that it prevents you from doing other tasks that are of perhaps higher relevance than keeping track of noise that isn't relevant to you. And at this point, I'm going to recommend that you take a look at these two sources, because one of these is a blog post version of this webinar. And so you can read the plain text of what we've been discussing. TechBeacon also has a really good article that I linked here for additional reading when we're talking about changing our mindset around building alerts and building workflows around alerts so that they keep us in a good place so that we can maintain pacing. And I'm going to open the floor up to questions at this point. Okay, let's see what we got. Will we be posting links to the studies? Yes. I can have links sent out in an email. I can also tweet them because this presentation is available publicly, and you all can have access to that after the presentation. And let's see, do we have any other questions? Let's see. I see someone asking about logs alerts as code. And can you actually clarify that question at all? Is there something specifically you're looking to accomplish where I can narrow an answer down for you? Or if you prefer, we can just follow up after the presentation with a more precise answer. Okay, here's one. Where to start with a ton of new exceptions if it's a new app or when you're trying to get this caught early on. Okay, so when you're maybe deploying a new application, or again, you're in a startup and you don't necessarily know what to expect just yet, what I would recommend is actually casting a wide net And then you can use a platform such as ours, which actually will allow you to aggregate your noise. And some of this you can actually use our insights for as well, depending on what noise you're looking at. And the idea is to start analyzing the noise. So it's going to be very loud at first. And there's very little you can do to avoid that initial sound blast. But what that allows you to do is once you see all of that information and you start to categorize it, that's when you have the opportunity to say, okay, I do need this, I don't need that, and you're going to whittle it down from that top starting point. And so when you ask about, you don't know the impact of each one yet, that's part of your categorization. Where if you say, okay, this threw this exception and then this service went out, well, now you know whatever that exception was is high priority, and you're going to make it a very noisy alert around that exception. Whereas if some other service for some reason is throwing errors but not actually going down, you might reduce the impact of the alert or completely eliminate it, again, depending on situation that you find yourself in. Looking at another question. Okay, so high memory usage alerts in code instead of using the UI. So what you could do, depending on your needs and how much engineering power you want to put behind it, et cetera, if you're using the API, our API for Elasticsearch or something similar to that, like you can write your own custom queries. And it depends on what you need to do for the high memory usage. If you're looking to have more granular tiering than is traditionally done in a monitoring service. So going back a little bit, because the idea is to have the sources code. So I would say if you needed to have a heavily customized solution, that you can actually use our documentation to accomplish that pretty well, because we have documentation around our API, and that's how I would recommend doing that. If you're looking for something, heavily customized, we have support engineers available that can assist with like a really targeted example. But outside of that, it's something that you can do if you find, as some do, that what's available by default isn't covering your use case, as can happen. Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay, I think we might actually be good. So in that case, thank you everyone for coming to the webinar. And I hope everyone is having a great day and a great week. And we look forward to seeing you all again at a future run of this presentation. Thank you.